Hello, and thank you for joining us for the 2024 Smithsonian National Education Summit. As you just heard, my name is Jessie Aucoin. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Education and Visitor Experience at the National Postal Museum here in DC. I hope some of you have been. Much like the incredible content you've been hearing about during the sessions this week, my team at NPM specializes in exploring the intersection points between stamp or philatelic history and postal history with other content areas. So the Smithsonian is an incredible home for us. And many of my team are actually presenting at the Education Summit this week, so I hope you get a chance to hear their sessions. But for today's session, we're going to be joined by two invited guests representing the National Council for Social Studies. The National Council for Social Studies, which I'm going to call NCSS from here on out because it's a tongue twister otherwise, is the largest professional association in the country devoted solely to social studies education, including elementary, secondary, and college teachers of history, civics, geography, economics, political science, sociology, psychology, anthropology, and live-related education. In this session, the presenters will share how to engage with primary sources and will think historically with your students. They'll model how to examine personal family artifacts to tell a story of American immigration, and they'll provide opportunities for thinking about the use of primary sources in your own teaching contexts. Representing the NCSS for Social Studies, NCSS, please help me welcome Executive Director Larry Pasca and 2024-2025 President of NCSS, Jenny Morgan.
Good afternoon, everybody. Glad you're here and not out in the heat. We're going to talk about inclusive storytelling and the people who are missing from our history books. I teach 8th grade U.S. history in western Wisconsin in a tiny little district that is about as white as you can get. So I think it's really important to fill in those missing pieces. So what we've called our presentation is Finding Your Voice, Telling Your Story, Inclusive Storytelling in the Social Studies Classroom. So I'm hoping you probably aren't going to be able to take my activity home and do it because it has personal connections to me, but each of you could do the very same thing with your own personal background. I usually do this at the beginning of the school year when we're working on historical thinking skills. So I want you to think a minute. What sparked your interest in social studies or history? For me, it was sitting down at a table with my great Uncle Joe, who lived to be 104 and had a clear mind till the very end, and feeding him topics, and he would just go on and on and on about people, places, events that he had lived through. It wasn't doing the questions at the end of the chapter and testing on Friday. I kind of took a look at the textbooks that are in my classroom. They're in my classroom. I think the 2016 have been opened twice, so that's the kind of teacher I am. I really don't use textbooks. But McGraw-Hill, I teach U.S. history, so early years in 2016, there were 277 men represented in the book. And this is not counting how many pages there are. You know, obviously, Lincoln, Washington have dozens of pages on them. 45 women, 113 are African Americans, 16 Hispanic or Latino, and 10 indigenous. And the textbook I had before that was done by Dr. Herman Viola for Scott Forsman, and there were 412 men, 58 women, 30 African Americans, 25 Latinos, and 21 indigenous folks mentioned in the book. So I think as a teacher, it's really important that our kids see themselves in what they learn, as well as see others that are out in the world that they might not encounter on a daily occasion. And I believe in the power of storytelling. I have the biggest compliment I've ever received as a teacher in 30 plus years was from a little special ed student who got rewarded because he got to come to my class at the end of the day if he was good the rest of the day. And if you're old enough to know Dennis the Menace, his name was Dennis, and That was kind of his behavior. And he would get so mad at the end of the day when he couldn't come see me because he said, I made up really good stories. Well, I didn't make up stories telling history. I was telling history as a story. But stories are very powerful. People get drawn into them. It evokes emotions. It's a great way to pass down heritage, traditions, and that's kind of what I'm going to do today. And it brings about the idea of continuity and connection to the past. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at a problem I was presented more than a dozen years ago. My uncle brought to me this box of things that belong to I don't tell my students this, but I'll tell you this, to my great-grandmother. And he knew nothing about her. She had died 3 years before he was born, so he knew nothing about her, and he was the oldest member of the family. And so I sat down and tried to figure out her story. And I have my kids do this every single year. There's a QR code if you want to get into the resources, because I'm going to have you think about them as well. But my students get paper copies of everything, and there are like 40 or 50 different documents that they get. And we spread them all over the floor, and they're just everywhere. And they're trying to match pictures and things like that to tell the story of the woman in the box or the woman in the envelope. Most of them get an envelope. And I come from a family of, let's say, organized keepers. They were pack rats. And my great-grandmother came here in 1893. So she didn't come through Ellis Island, so not an easy woman to track down. And everything I know is based on my historical thinking skills and my research skills, what I've been able to track down about her, and some of what my kids suggest. They, say, oh, what about this? Because they can tell me anything about this woman in the envelope, but they have to support it. You can't just say, oh, she did this. Okay, which of these pieces of evidence show that she did this? So I'm going to have you open up the documents. And I know they're really tiny on a phone. I'm sorry. And I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to take a look at her documents. And I want you to think about these items. Who is the central person in the story? Who's in her family? Where did she come from and where did she go? What did she do for a living? What things are important to her? And why did she come to America? That's a question I still have. But sometimes, depending on the group of 8th graders I have, I don't give them any questions and just tell them to tell the story of the woman in the envelope. Other times I need to kind of lead them to the information, but this kind of gives them a start. So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to take a look and see what you can tell me about this woman in the envelope. And then I will tell you my story as I know it about the woman in the envelope. Yep. Yep. And if you want, you can work with a neighbor. That would have to be back at the, there. I don't have access to the slides. I don't have access to that. That's all back there. There's no links here. So I'll be talking. There's a QR code and there's a link at the bottom in the presenter note. I thought I put a link on here and it's not in this one. So, and they're having troubles getting with the QR code. I have control of the slides. I just don't have that control. I'll give you a couple more minutes. And maybe if you can't access, maybe a neighbor can and you can look off of theirs. About 45 seconds more. Typically, my students have almost an hour to look through all this information. Okay, so if you notice, we start with the most basic of questions. Who is the woman in the envelope? What does this all relate to? Who do you think it is? Mary Gunther, which is what she's known as when she's here in America. But she was also Maria, one and the same person. She changes her name when she comes to America to make it sound more American and less German. So that's a good conversation with students as to how names change and why names might change. Who's in her family? And I actually didn't put all the resources in there because it gets really confusing. Besides me, she had 2 sons. She had Leonard, who was my grandfather, and she had a son named Paul. And if I'd put all the resources in there, there's actually 3 Pauls in the story. There's her brother Paul, her son Paul, and her grandson Paul. And her grandson Paul was my uncle who gave me the contents of the box. And I may slip into saying Big Paul, that would be my great uncle, and Paul would be my uncle. Where did she come from? She came from Germany. She actually came from the Silesian region of Germany, so it's actually over on the Polish border. And where did she go? Bonus points if you can actually pronounce the town. She went to my tiny little hometown of Potosi, Wisconsin, population of 800 people today. What did she do for a living? She was a maid, and there were a couple of pieces of evidence in there that showed that she was a maid. She had a work permit where they stamped weekly, and she had to go to the police station to have it stamped that she worked each week. And she actually worked through, she would go to the church, and the church would assign her a position where she was supposed to go. And she would do that when she comes to America before she marries as well. And that kind of turns into a sad story. When she was here in Wisconsin, she worked at a place called the Jackson House in my tiny little hometown, cleaning house. And it depends on the class I have whether I share this story or not. But she finds herself pregnant through rape, and her son, Big Paul, for the rest of his life will be trying to figure out who his father was. He died when I was 6, so... But I've heard people tell me that he frequently went through the cemeteries trying to find out ideas of who his dad might have been. And in digging through the census, I think I might have found it because they're listed at the Jackson House. And you know how the census, you go up to the top of each address and it tells you everybody's relationship to the person at the top. And she's listed as a servant to the Jackson House, to Mr. Jackson, and he's listed as a son to Mr. Jackson. So I don't know if I found the answer to that one or not, but it's kind of an interesting question. So she serves as a maid until she marries in 1900. And that's actually their wedding picture. That is my great-grandfather George and my great-grandmother Mary. George was a farmer in a tiny little town. They would raise Paul and then my uncle, and then my grandfather, who comes along about 6 years later. And he actually has a really, really unusual death. And this is one thing I can confirm. He actually dies of anthrax poisoning. Men of the day used horsehair shaving brushes. Anthrax is carried through horses, and so it's believed he had a contaminated horsehair shaving brush. And he died of anthrax, and she would live on in my tiny little town into her 80s. I have my entire presentation, but I thought I put a link in here, and if you want to go to that QR code, that actually gives you my entire story of items here. But she will live with her sons in a house that my family owned until 2010. And I have documentation of the deed that goes in, that's in among the documents to the house that they purchased for $2,500 with lots of land. And I can trace her through tax records. I can trace her there. We're in there if you got far enough. There's actually electric bills. There's grocery lists that she wrote on the back of electric bills. I like the old electric bills because on the reverse side, they show the newest fangled electronic thing that you can buy. So there's advertisements on the back, so you get to tell a little bit about the time frame. If you saw in there was a picture of my grandmother taking a photo of somebody taking a picture of her. You know, that was in, well, let's see, my grandpa was born in 1904. And he looked maybe 8 or 10, standing behind her, going like this. I actually have that camera. It's a Brownie box camera. This is a really interesting project to do with students. And they have a blast doing it. And what I find by telling my story, and pretty much by telling my story, introducing them to me, and what's important to me. Actually, go back to that question. What was important to her? What type of things did you see in her collection of things? Church, gives to charity. There was receipts to newspapers. There were photos of families. There was a recipe card in there, which was very unusual because both she and my grandmother cooked by, dumping until it looked good and then tasted good. So there are very few recipes that were written down, but it's actually a family favorite called apple roll. Very good recipe. Doesn't look very good, but it ends up being really good. Why did she come to America? And that is my really big question, one that I have no clue. She comes to America by herself. She comes on one of the boats in the Red Star Line, which has a sister corporation called the White Star Line, which included the Titanic. So thankfully she didn't come then. And there's a ticket to her arrival. She goes from Hamburg to Antwerp to Montreal and then comes to Chicago before she takes the train to tiny little Potosi, Wisconsin. And she comes alone. She actually has written permission. One of the forms in all my documents is a letter that her father wrote to the German consulate giving her permission to leave. Germans at that time typically traveled as families. I don't know why she chose to come on her own. My best guess is she was very strongly Catholic, and the Pope around that same time was having a disagreement with the Kaiser, and these May laws were passed that did things like jail priests. So that's my best guess. She does join a distant relative in Potosi, so that explains why she goes there, but I don't know why she comes to Wisconsin, and all of her family stays behind. If you got into the documents far enough, there's a letter. It's written in German, but everything in German is also translated into English. And it's a letter that multiple people all wrote on the same letter. So they would send it, and she'd receive it, and then she'd put her letter on the bottom. And it's about just like everyday things. One of them talks about this woman in Germany that disappeared, and she reappears years later, and she has a new husband, just like town gossip. They write about finding a Christmas tree. Mary is concerned. She's been sending all this stuff back to Germany, and she's concerned that somebody's stealing it before it gets to them. So she sends lists of things that she has sent, like a fancy apron, some food items in there as well, so that they can say, yeah, we got this, or no, we didn't get this. But it's all on one letter, so it's really kind of cool to see the correspondence between the two. I have no clue why she came, but I have found her in the cemetery, and her church life was really important to her. In my little hometown, there's two hometowns. There's a highway that goes down the middle, and north of it is the town of Tennyson, which has about 300 people in it, and south of it is Potosi, which has about 700 people in it. And we have two Catholic churches. And one was the German Catholic Church, and one was the Irish Catholic Church. And she starts by going to the Irish Catholic Church. And for some reason, she has a falling out with the priest there. I don't know what about. And so she goes to the German Catholic Church for the rest of her life. She's buried in the German Catholic Church cemetery. But then, ironically, my grandfather and grandmother go to the Irish Catholic Church when she's gone. But I find this is a great way to get the kids thinking historically. Get kids thinking about people living history. Every one of us here is living history. And I often, as an exit slip, when they're leaving my room, have them think about and write down what you're leaving behind telling future generations about you. Is somebody going to find your report card? There's a report card in there. And I was really excited because they have both geography and history, and I'm a social studies person, so she had two social studies classes I thought was really cool, and she did really well in those. She got a grade for diligence, but she got a D in art, and that would explain why I am not an artist in any way, shape, or form. But it's a really great conversation piece, and the kids work in groups, and they sit all over the floor, and I'm walking between them, and just to listen and hear, well, this is what happens, and this is why it happens. And somebody sitting next to them could have a totally different story of the same woman, and they all have the same content. But it really gives them a chance to think, and not, as I said earlier at our own leadership conference down the street, not do the sit, get, and spit social studies that I had, where you sat, you took notes, and then you spit it all back on Friday. Actually have to think about social studies. And I'm going to introduce Dr. Larry Pasca, and he's going to finish us off.
Thank you, Jenny. Good afternoon, everyone. So, how do we translate this for our own learners in our own environment? So I'm going to ask you 2 questions. See them up here already. Because I think our challenge now is how can we create this type of personal storytelling in our own social studies classes, in our own literacy classes. So I'm going to ask you, and you can shout answers out, what's a question you heard a child ask in the past week? You know, what's a question you've heard a child ask? Doesn't have to be a student, could be a child in the grocery store, summer camp, family barbecue. Does the president choose his vice president or her vice president? Great question. What subject answers that question best? Social studies? Okay. Another question. Why do I have to be flexible? I love that. Well, that's a great question. What school subject might answer that? Physical education, SEL. Some good choices there. Definitely the social. What else? Another question. Do you know a joke? Do you know a joke? What subject may help answer that? Depends on the joke, I guess, right? English, creative writing. Well, my joke here was, congratulations, every subject is a social studies question. But I think it is true because I've been asked that when I was teaching. Do you know a joke? Can you, it's a humor. But truthfully, every question can be turned into a social studies question, can be turned into an opportunity to learn about the human experience. And that really is to us what social studies is all about, right? It's about human experience, what makes us human. And so, yeah, can you tell jokes? Am I flexible? Who am I as a person? Sure, phys ed, absolutely. But SEL, who am I as a person? Am I flexible in my thinking, perhaps? So what is the social studies story you want to tell? So we at NCSS have recently revised our definition of social studies. We had a very good definition for many years that I think, as you heard in the introduction, was a lot about all the disciplines that make up what we do. Because your questions and the stories that Jenny shared and the stories that you bring and your students bring are more than just the listing of subjects. That's more than just anthropology, archaeology, we'll name all the ologies, right? It's about how we come together as individuals, as communities, as systems, and how we interact across time and place with this ultimate goal of just being prepared for civic life, and what that even means, right? And so we have a position about this where we believe that what we do is about putting the learner at the center of experience. We believe that we have an opportunity for quality of that learning experience, and that civic engagement is part of what happens for us when, not part of, it's the ultimate goal of what happens for us when we focused on the power of story in social studies. So one of the things we've done as a resource we've offered is we're so grateful for partners like the Smithsonian, like the National Archives, the Library of Congress, through work we've done with the Library of Congress. And you may be familiar with something called the Teaching with Primary Sources grant. We are a proud recipient of that grant. And over the past few years, we have created a series of methods texts online. And they were supposed to originally be for methods professors and their students to talk about how do you use sources to tell stories? How do you use primary sources to foster inquiry? Well, they're still for methods professors, but boy, we all can use them, right? They're free. They're on our website. So I invite you to what I hope is one of the easier URLs you get in life, socialstudies.org/TPS, Teaching with Primary Sources. We have over 1,200 pages of content, all free. If you don't feel like reading that at the beach or the pool this weekend, we also have over a dozen downloadable videos. We have curriculum inquiries that have been developed by professors across the country, all of this is free content. All of it is developed through partners like the Smithsonian and the library. And it's all about how do you foster that concept of story, that love of story and that love of question, and using a good inquiry question and then diving into sources. And sometimes, my favorite part of texts like these is sometimes we can't find the source. We're very lucky through Jenny's box to be able to identify and really piece together a story. But one of the things our writers of these chapters learn early on is it's sometimes hard to find the documents. Unfortunately, when major turning points were happening, people might not have been there snapping photographs or taking pictures or recording it. So another part of the story, and this is an activity that we like to do with colleagues. We did this at our own Summer Leadership Institute this week. But I might invite you to think of these questions for your students as you're asking them to think about the power of story in their lives. And that is, how do you help find your own voice to tell your story or to tell the story of others? And one of the next few things I'm going to share, they were in the context of how to be an advocate for yourself as a social studies teacher, but to us, they resonate as questions you might ask about how do you help tell your story, or how do you help convey your perspective, or what your role or what your view of the world might be. And a lot of this goes to who are the people that are hearing you, and how each of us may hear a story in a different way. So who are you with? What would that person want to hear or know about you? Where are you? Are you in a place where perhaps a long story with lots of documents is good? Or are you standing in an elevator and you have 10 seconds to talk to somebody about your story and what might be exciting or important about it? Are the people you're meeting with and sharing that story with people you will see again? Why would you talk about social studies or share your social studies story with them? And how do you talk briefly and effectively about stories? So in just 15, 20 minutes, we learned a lot about Jenny's background, her ancestry. I learned a lot about Wisconsin and the town you're in, and the culture and the life. How do you help convey that sense to people? And how do you help your students be those kinds of storytellers? When we talk about storytelling from a leadership perspective or to our educators, it's about telling the story of social studies to different people who may not always hear it or may not always know what we're about. So how might a school or a district administrator want to hear your story about social studies versus maybe a member of your Board of Education versus maybe a member of a state Board of Education, very different person? How might a community or an elected leader want to hear the story of social studies? How might the media want to hear your story? Parents, students, how might a celebrity or an influencer want to hear your story? These are all different types of people that might hear our story in the same way. And so if I were to present my story of social studies, or I might present my immigrant's journey or my experience or my sources, bringing them forward, it may look very different what I'm sharing, how I'm sharing, and to whom. If you're interested in learning about how to tell a story of social studies and the power of the discipline, we have some resources that we proudly make available to everyone. We have an advocacy toolkit where everything from how you craft your story to how you shape it in front of elected leaders to how you shape it in front of community members, all of that goes into the work that we have. And I have these couple of catchphrases here. I don't know if they're meant to be silly or serious or what, but I always try to remember a few things. We also do another experiment sometimes where we ask, if we use the word STEM, what does that word sound like to us? And if we use the word social studies, what does that word sound to us? So STEM, as we know what STEM is. We really see ourselves as the original STEM, that the power of the human story in social studies, in school, that was the original STEM. It was over 100 years ago, bringing history, geography, economics, civics, all of these disciplines together under this one giant foundation called social studies. And when we ask students and we ask teachers, we ask our leaders to advocate for social studies, to tell the social studies story, we want to remind ourselves that social media, while good, and while it does a lot of good things in communicating and bringing us together, and sometimes taking us apart and such, but it can be a force for good if we'd like it to be. It's not the same thing as social studies. So as we're asking our students to tell their story and share their story, and we're trying to share the story of how storytelling and social studies really matter. It's not just through social media, that we can't call the Facebook post, the like, the share, the tweet, the Instagram video, the X, I guess we'll call it now, the X, that's not just social studies in and of itself. So we do want to kind of go back and I think have some time for questions, but what we would like to encourage everyone to think about today is not just the power of the stories that you may bring or your kids may bring, but then how might you translate that to telling that story of social studies and how profound it is. And what better place than hopefully a cultural institution like this one. But please also know that there are millions and millions of resources, all free, all easily downloadable. I know you're seeing a lot of them here at this summit. You'll see them in a lot of other places. We encourage you to go to our site, but also to sites like the Library of Congress with their online collections, the National Archives, where we just were for 3 days, because these resources all help you craft those stories very easily, very effectively, and the best part for us as educators is very cheaply, or freely, I guess, or I don't know is the word, but. So we will stop at this point. I think Jenny and I would welcome your questions or thoughts. I know this was kind of designed as, this last part was designed a little bit as a pitch of advocacy for social studies and how we might be those social studies storytellers. But we want to be able to talk to you a little bit more about the power of story in our discipline.
Thank you both. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. As Larry mentioned, we are going to transition to Q&A now. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask either Larry or Jenny, please feel free to stand up. We've got microphones on either side of the room, and we'll get an opportunity to bounce back and forth between people. While you get situated and move around the room to do that, I did want to open with a question, if that's okay. And I am biased, as you may remember, I work at the Postal Museum, so I immediately picked up on any letter content, the stamps in Mary's work journal. I was like, those aren't revenue stamps, they're not postage stamps. I wonder if we should be collecting those stamps. Anyway, so I immediately, I'm selfish, I immediately turned it around on me and my team and our students. But I did want to ask Jenny, if there was anything that you learned in the letters that you have in that box about Mary that you feel like was particularly only available in those written communications. And I'm going to ask that because, selfishly, if you go to the Postal Museum's website and go to our search bar and type in genealogy, you'll find a series of resources on how to use letters, envelopes, and the information that you find in and on those to help in any family research that you may have. So just a little sidebar. But yeah, Jenny, any info you found from there?
So I really lucked out just because there is so much info. I mean, she even kept the envelopes to everything. So I could tell locations where she was on which dates. As I said, I love that letter where they all write on the same letter and they're all telling about what's going on in the Little Potosi and Little Gunzersdorf in Germany. Basically everything I know about her I found there or a little bit in Ancestry, and that's about it. There's nobody to tell me her story anymore. So I'm the oldest in my family, so it's kind of a lot of guesswork, but I really love the old, that one big letter. I am going to take, I think one of my slides was missing. I'm going to take this project that I've done, and I'm really going to focus this year on unheard voices. The theme to the conference we just finished up at the archives was finding your voice and telling your story. And I want my kids to dig into people who we don't see in the history books. And it's going to be a year-long project. They're going to create a podcast at the very end. And it's going to be people, I'm going to let them pick whoever they want, but I'm going to lead with some ideas. I teach in a town of about 4,000 people, and there are a lot of cool people that came from where I teach. Edna Gardner White, first woman ever owned an airport. George Taylor, anybody know who George Taylor is? He ran against Teddy Roosevelt for president and was the first African-American candidate for president. Those don't make the history books, but it would make them proud of who they were. And the ability, and those are not going to be easy stories. You know, it's not going to be like going to the library and pulling out a George Washington book. They're going to have to dig. So we'll create the podcast at the end of the year, hopefully. Any other questions?
Yeah, so I teach third grade, and part of our studies is looking at enslaved people and Native Americans in the area. And often what we come up against with so many marginalized groups is the erasure of history and the erasure of primary sources. How do you reconcile or recommend using primary sources to tell those stories while knowing the inherent bias in many of them?
Very good question. It's really difficult because you said there's not a whole lot of information from the enslaved perspective in most cases. I try to find stories in places that I travel that may, you know, I'm I'm still a secondary source, but I've heard their stories. So I'll give an example. I was just at Frederick Douglass House and learned a whole lot about his story there. Highly recommend it if you've never been. Native Americans, another challenge, because a lot of those are oral history based, and we really tried to take away their languages. Fortunately, I do teach in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin has a law that requires me to teach Native American history. And we have had that since 1992. So I try to use sources from the tribes, especially the tribes in our area. I always try and tie history to what was going on where I teach, because kids are interested in that. They know, oh, that's what those white things are. You know, yeah, they're markers that mark the Black Hawk Trail from the Black Hawk War. Again, another paragraph in their textbook.
Hello. I'm a faculty advisor for a multicultural club, and what I do is I have the students explore their own personal history before they actually begin to try to hear the voices of others. Is there any way that you have your students, have you ever had your students create their own women in a box and bring in artifacts from their own personal history? And what does that look like if you've done it?
I've not formally done it, but that doesn't mean it hasn't happened. The kids will, you know, see my presentation, and then they'll suddenly start bringing stuff out of the attic, and like, oh, we found this really cool thing. I think it's from the Civil War, and yeah, somebody's enlistment papers that was up in their attic. Or, you know, I had one young lady that her grandfather fought at Hamburger Hill, and she interviewed him, and they brought the tape in, and it was a really cool experience. He had never talked about it before. So it just inspired them to bring their stuff in, not necessarily a formal project, but the idea that they want to share. And for middle school kids, that's a big thing, if they want to share.
If I could, can I? Yep. Sorry, I'm going to add, it's totally not my presentation, but I'm going to add a couple things. I did used to work at an organization where we did a lot of family history research, and Ancestry.com has a dedicated site to education resources. So it's ancestryclassroom.com if you want to get some information there. But also one of the things that I learned in that project that may be of importance or relevance to that most recent question was a strong hesitation from like trained genealogists to encourage teachers to do a structured project on family history research using the students' families, because it is such a complicated matter that you don't know what their family history is, you don't know what their current family situation may be like. So I took this to heart too, which is what Jenny's doing, is, you know, really focusing more on like local history or local individuals that don't have that personal connection to you in the genetic sense, if that makes sense. Sorry. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Baina, and I'm a refugee. Also, I'm a teacher. I work with children in our community center, refugee children and immigrants. And the question is, it's that I really love this idea. I was writing down everything that you said. The question is, I belong to an ethnic minority from Russia. and during some historical tragic pages, our history was distinguished. We were deported to Siberia. They changed our name. We almost, our language is almost dead, and we don't have our history. Everything that was written were distinguished. And the question is, how may I support our children in our community to present their story?
If I hadn't had to travel halfway across the country, I would have brought the second activity for this one, which is actually as I said, the house stayed in our family for over 100 years, and my sister lived in it for a while, and she would call me up and say, I found some more of Grandma's junk. Do you want it? And of course I said yes. And I can tell the story of my great-grandma through her stuff from her kitchen. So don't think of it beyond just the written work, but what do you have that might be able to be created into an oral history or physical items, which kids love. And I let them, they don't have to have gloves on. These are really old things that have absolutely no value except sentimental. So I have like an angel food cake cutter. Have you ever seen one of those? And like a canning funnel. And what I find is the kids that know absolutely nothing in class, never volunteer for anything because they don't know anything, they know every single one of those items. It just totally amazes me. Like, oh, that's a canning funnel, or that's this. And they're so proud and they're so excited by that.
We've got time for one more question.
Yeah, you talk about social studies being stories and history being interpretation. And we come up with all the lost stories and forgotten dreams that have been suppressed or forgotten, ignored. What are your thoughts on historical fiction, bringing these stories back and filling in the details with a little bit more interpretation, but also, bringing the emotional framework to the facts and figures?
I personally love historical fiction, but it's not something you can just do the historical novel. You have to teach the background to it, so you can't just give them Anne Frank and expect they're going to know what's going on. So you have to put it in context as to what's going on. So I have used it in class. I haven't used like really old history in class, but I've used the book A Long Walk to Water by Linda Sue Park, which is part fiction and part reality, and have done a lot of, it's about a little girl, or a little boy that has to walk for water, and it's about one man who becomes a member of the Lost Tribes of Sudan, the Lost Boys. So I have to give them background for them to totally understand it. So I love it. It's a great way to get kids hooked on the history, but in and of itself, on its own, I wouldn't recommend it.
And I just want to say really fast, I'm a huge believer that we're story thinkers, we're storytellers, we love narrative in general. I have twin 11-year-olds at home. The only way that I started to get them into social studies, you would think, like it would just be like social studies, that's what we do. But it was historical fiction, and then the minute they would start to read something, one of my daughters said one day, because all of a sudden she's like wanting me to quiz her on the states and their locations. I'm like, oh, why now? This is great. Well, because the book used a lot of state references, and she got frustrated not knowing where they were and wanted to know and wanted me to help her. So anything I think that can appropriately do that. I've had one of my other daughters brought home this year a book that she was reading and wanted to watch the film version of it, and we did, and it was good. I mean, it wasn't great, but she wanted the story. She wanted to learn more about colonial America through that. So we would encourage it. I also did research years ago and on a state test looking at documents and a printed document versus a video. And how would kids react to the film version of what was written? Kids reacted to the film. They wrote about the film. They wrote about the story. Half the film was wrong. The information was very overgeneralized. It was about Columbus, and we can always talk about what some of the debates are there. But the point was, they they were moments in a film, like a 3 seconds of footage that they somehow interpreted into their writing. So they would talk about the weather that day, or they would talk about something on the location because that just stuck with them. So, I would say, by all means, have that be part of.
So isn't part of the learning history is learning how to be a historian and figuring out what is
Yep.
true and what is fact?
Yep. Yeah, and my favorite activity to do with students is, and I used to do this, and I know it's been made popular if you follow former Stanford History Education Group. We used to, they have a really great activity on the first Thanksgiving, but the question is just, when was this made and what does that tell you about it? And it's the whole idea is, the painting's not about the first Thanksgiving and all that we should learn about that. It's about the time period it was created in and what that tells us. But again, the hard part of that, and I think we see that, especially I taught middle school, is you have to let go of a lot of talk time and content time to get to that. But anyway, yeah, at all costs, and I realized as I was talking, I heard myself say the word story about 6,000 times, but it's because it really is our theme for the year, that we're trying to double down on the power of story as social studies. So your story that you advocate for, the stories that your kids tell, the stories that you can create, and experiences and narratives you can create for your kids.
Let's give them a round of applause.